Welcome back. So this is the last sort of main video of chapter 20, and then we have a video for the appendix. But here we want to talk about sort of the optimal currency area, right? So, how large should a currency area be? And, how do we decide that, right? So if you think about the United States is a large country. We all use the dollar. Should it be smaller? Should we have multiple currencies in the United States? Should we have a larger system where Canada and Mexico and the United States all use the same currency? And of course, this was the question that Europe faced, in the post-World War II period. And they moved forward with the European Union and the Euro area. And there's been a lot of debate about that within the economic community about whether or not this was a wise decision. So let's talk about that a little bit. So Robert Mundell sort of said, all right, well, if we are going to have the same currency, then we need to satisfy one of these two conditions. Either the countries have to experience similar shocks, right? And so that means they go into recession at the same time, they go into expansion at the same time, or they must have high factor mobility. And so high factor mobility means that labor can move around, capital can move around, etc. Now, I would also say that you want to really have a common fiscal policy, right? Because one of the things that is different between the United States and Europe is that while the United States, each state does have its own, state governments, and even within those local governments, we have one overarching federal government, and that federal government can help smooth out different shocks, right? And so the United States has both high factor mobility. It does have different shocks, right? There are going to be different shocks in California than Florida than New York. But it also has a common fiscal policy, and that common fiscal policy can tax areas that are doing well and distribute, resources to areas that are not doing well. So I think that's also an important piece here. So if we look at Europe especially, we can say, all right, well, is that an optimal currency area? So, I mean, certainly with the euro and the European Union, they did have free factor mobility. So, capital could move around the continent. Labor was allowed to move around the continent. They definitely have different shocks. So, there are different shocks in, Spain and Italy and Greece and Germany and France, etc. So it's kind of an open question. I mean, do they have true factor mobility? Maybe not. So this is just one graph that might sort of try to answer that question, which looks at the real exchange rate in Spain since the adoption of the euro. And you can see that Spain experienced a boom in the first part of the 2000s. And because of that, its price level increased. That led to a real appreciation compared to its trading partners. And then when the financial crisis hit, it led to a long real depreciation. And we know that even this depreciation has not really been enough to get Spain back on its feet. Spain had, even by 2015, Spain still had an unemployment rate of around 20%. And so it's not clear that, a European central bank in Frankfurt, Germany, can provide the right monetary policy for the entire Eurozone. And I think, that's been the real question. And of course, it's important also to remember that the European Union and the Eurozone were not only an economic decision, they were also a political decision in that, they were trying to avoid, another world war on the continent after World War I and World War II. So in that respect, it's been very successful, right? Europe, especially Western Europe, but increasingly all of the continent are very much political allies that are unlikely to go to war with each other. So if we think about the European Monetary Union, how did it work? Well, we started off with capital controls being abolished in 1990 so that capital could move freely throughout the continent. In 1994, we had fixed parities of the exchange rate so that, the exchange rate between the franc and the Deutschmark and the lira and the drachma were all within these very narrow bands. And then in 1999, we had the European Central Bank and the euro. And so the euro became the common currency. And so now right now it's a common currency. There's no exchange rate, nominal exchange rate. As we saw with Spain, there can still be a real exchange rate difference because of differences in the price levels in the different countries. And part of that, I think, is definitely that, there's no common fiscal policy on the continent, right? There's a little bit of, fiscal policy that gets spread out through the continent, but really it's all still national, despite having, a common monetary policy. In the United States, what we see with price levels is that price levels are pretty much the same, except for one major price, which is housing. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because housing is, the least mobile good. So you can't, if housing is expensive in New York and cheap in Mississippi, we can't move housing from one place to the other, right? We can't move a bunch of housing from Mississippi to New York. The best we can hope to do is move a bunch of New Yorkers to Mississippi, but that doesn't always happen as well. And so that is basically what leads to the major cost of living differences around the country, is housing. Everything else is pretty similar. Obviously, there are some services that are going to be different based on sort of demand factors, but housing is definitely an important piece there. So why would you want to have a fixed exchange rate? Well, you want to convince financial investors that your interest rates are going to be low. You want to convince trade that the exchange rate is going to be the same. And so either you can do that by having a fixed exchange rate as part of a more general macro package like Bretton Woods, but you can also do a hard peg. And so a hard peg is basically trying to say, listen, I'm definitely having a fixed exchange rate. There's no way I'm not going to have this fixed exchange rate. And there are really two ways to do that. One is dollarization, which basically replaces the domestic currency with the dollar. So that's what Zimbabwe did after its experience with hyperinflation. And then it finally replaced that with a Zimbabwean dollar, but it was still exchanged, one for one with the dollar. Or you can do a currency board, and basically a currency board is ready to exchange foreign currency for the domestic currency at whatever that fixed exchange rate is. But of course that can get fairly expensive because you can run out of foreign exchange if a lot of people want to exchange your currency for dollars. So just thinking about that, for example, with an example from Argentina. So Argentina had, some hyperinflation in the late 80s, early 90s, and said, okay, we're going to have a currency board that would exchange pesos for dollars. And it worked at first, right? So we had, hyperinflation of 2,300% in 1990 to 4% in 1994. But the problem is once you have that fixed exchange rate, right, now all of a sudden you have to worry about the value of the dollar as well as the peso. And what happened was appreciation of the dollar in the second half of the 1990s led to a decrease in demand for Argentina's good because it was also an appreciation of the Argentinian peso. That was not what Argentina wanted or needed. And so in 2002, Argentina gave up on the currency board and let the peso float.